My name is Lisa Clarke. I'm a research librarian contracted to the NOAA Central Library, and today I'm delighted to host this library seminar that highlights one of the many exciting NOAA projects that our library's research service supports. The presentation titled, "If YOI Build It, They Will Survey, Relationship Between Outreach and Effort in a Rockfish Citizen Science Project," is not the much anticipated sequel to the late 80s movie Field of Dreams. However, it is a wonderful story about a collaboration between a NOAA conservation scientist in Washington State, a SCUBA-based citizen science program, and a little help from a librarian. We have a panel of 3 speakers today who will tell the story of this work to set the stage. Our first speaker is Dr. Dayv Lowry, Natural Resource Management Specialist and Rockfish Recovery Coordinator for NOAA Fisheries, West Coast Region Protected Resource Division in the Seattle branch office. He will tell us about the ESA-listed rockfish, the Salish Sea, and the specific life history research that brought him to the library, not just once, but twice. Thank you, Dave. Dave has researched and managed living marine resources and their habitats on the west coast of the United States for 18 years, both at the state and federal level. He's a strong proponent of ecosystem-based management and experiential public outreach, and he advocates for public engagement to enhance the transparency and accessibility of resource management decisions at every level. Our second speaker, Adam Obaza, will tell us about the development of the Young of the Year Citizen Science SCUBA project, from its inception to its implementation, as well as the writing of a regional monitoring plan that he, Dave, and their team are working on as we speak. Adam is a marine biologist with Paua Marine Research Group, where he works on recovery of ESA-listed species and restoration of coastal habitats all along the West Coast. He's worked on policy and research issues related to eelgrass, invasive species, and abalone. And on top of all that, he's an incredible underwater photographer. Last, I will describe the role of the NOAA Central Library's research service on finding literature that identified comparable programs around the world to enhance interpretation of this citizen science program's efficacy. So let's get started. The mic is yours, Dave.
All right. Thank you for that great introduction, Lisa, and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Hopefully our screens are sharing, everything's good to go, and we can get off and running. So today we're going to talk a lot about rockfish, and so I thought that the first thing I do is just answer that simple question: what is a rockfish? Many of you may not have ever experienced one, may not have ever fished for one, may be completely unaware of the group. So when you say rockfish, this is a great example of one. It's a marine species, it lives on the bottom, it lives in association with rocks, and it looks a lot like a rock. They're camouflaged, they're adapted to be very inconspicuous when they're in their rocky homes. Now, that's an obvious example here, but there are actually a lot of different species, and we'll talk about different species other than this brown rockfish today. Rockfishes themselves share a variety of traits, and so just to give you a little bit about the background biology of these animals so that you can understand them a bit more and why and how we manage them, I just want to share a few quick things with you. So first off, as I said, they're marine species. They eat fish, crustaceans, worms. Like most fish, they'll effectively eat anything that will fit into their mouth. They grow very slowly, only a few centimeters each year in length. They have internal fertilization and live birth. So they do mate. There is a mating dance. The male and female come together and press the bottom sides of their bodies together and fertilize internally. The female then broods those eggs and gives live birth to larvae. They have what's called sporadic recruitment success. And essentially, this is a fancy term just saying sometimes we have really good settlement events with lots and lots of babies out there, and sometimes we don't. The ocean conditions are just not right for it, and so we end up essentially missing a year of settlement or with a very weak recruitment pulse in any given year. They have low adult natural mortality because these are big, spiny animals. They live on the bottom, and they have lots of places to hide and tuck in, and so it's relatively hard to eat these critters. Very few things do, especially once they get to a really big size where they're really big and spiky and aggressive and can fight back. And how do they get to that big size? Well, only growing a few centimeters a year, that means they have to live a long time. So it may take them between 5 and 25 years to grow to the point where they're mature enough to have babies. And some species will live better than 100 years, and in the case of the rough-eye rockfish, up to 200 years or more. How do we know that? Well, if you look to the right, there's a photo here of taking out an ear bone or an otolith from a rockfish. And essentially we can read these much like rings on a tree, and we can get the age of these fish. So I said that it depends on species. Well, how many species are there? I showed you a typical rockfish, a bottom-dwelling, dark, inconspicuous species, but there are actually over 100 species that come in a variety of colors, shapes, sizes. They do utilize rock and they do sit on the bottom, but there are also species that spend time up in the water column, up off the bottom, what we refer to as pelagic or semi-pelagic species. They come in all kinds of bright colors and patterns and shapes. And for most of these species that are bright orange or bright red, you say, well, that's not very inconspicuous. They must be easy to eat. Well, don't forget that red light actually decays really quickly with depth in marine water. And so these fish are effectively camouflaged. They show up as gray underwater or not reflecting light. It's only once we bring them up to the surface or enhance them with light underwater that you see these bright orange and red colors. So as I said, in total, there's over 100 species of rockfish around the world. There's more than 70 species in just the Northeast Pacific, and there's 28 known species in the Salish Sea. Now, the Salish Sea may be a term that's new and potentially you've never heard it before, but I guarantee you've heard of the area that I'm talking about. The Salish Sea is the inland waters of Washington State and British Columbia, Canada. And so this includes Puget Sound, which is the term that many people are familiar with for this region. Puget Sound is technically just a small portion of the southern Salish Sea, but the Salish Sea also includes the Strait of Juan de Fuca and Georgia. It's a really complex geography. You can see here there are several big river basins, lots of different islands and little narrow cuts, fjords and areas where water can really kind of get stagnated or mix in strange and unique ways because of the upwelling that occurs. There are also several large cities and ports and industrial areas associated with this. And some of those, again, are common terms. I'm sure you've heard of these places: Seattle, Tacoma, Vancouver, British Columbia. And I've also got starred on here Victoria and Olympia, the two capitals of the respective areas. So let's focus a little bit on just the southern part of that and talk about, because I'm from NOAA and because I previously worked for the state of Washington, let's talk about fisheries in this southern section of the Salish Sea. So the name Salish Sea comes from the Coast Salish people and recognizes the fact that there have been people here, indigenous people in the region, for thousands of years, and we have midden data to show that they've consumed rockfish over the whole of that time. What we refer to as modern or state-run fisheries really didn't develop until the 1940s, associated with the World Wars. And they went along kind of at low levels from 1940 to about 1970, when a legal decision termed the Bolt decision reaffirmed the rights of treaty people in the area to 50% of the living marine resources. So essentially, all of a sudden, the rules changed, if you will, in a legal sense. And what had to happen was co-management of these resources. Because people were very focused on salmon at the time, rockfish were actually marketed as a salmon alternative. So essentially, hey, the rules have changed and your slice of the pie for salmon may have gotten smaller, but don't worry, there's still plenty of things to fish for out there. So from 1974 through the early 2000s, people fished. You can see that big spike in the 80s through 2000s, but you also see that the harvest dropped off. Part of that was because of progressive regulations, closing down fisheries, reducing bag limits, things like that. But part of this was part of the reason that the state was regulating in that way was because some of the rockfish stocks had started to decline. We were seeing fewer and fewer individuals. And since 2010, we've actually had no directed fisheries for rockfish in Puget Sound. Now, also coincident with that, jumping back just a minute, in 2009, as we were seeing these declines in the stocks, we realized that we really needed to do a solid job of trying to go in and assess the status of these stocks and these species in the area. And so after an assessment done by Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife in 2009, they determined that over half the stocks were either precautionary or depleted, a status term that we use to basically say, we're getting to a point where we're in trouble here. We may have to slow down fisheries, we may have to consider hatcheries, we may have to protect habitat areas. We may have to consider marine protected areas to reduce the impacts that are occurring on these species. Unfortunately, this assessment relied a lot on trawl and drop camera data, and it really missed a lot of the rocky habitat where these species spend most of their life history. The reason for this is just quite simple. We hadn't focused a lot of effort on assessing these species because they weren't big fisheries. If you compare that last figure to the salmon fisheries in the area, it's a very small drop in the bucket, and crab fisheries and shrimp fisheries and other things. So there just wasn't necessarily the need until this kind of evaluation of the declines really spurred us to kind of change that policy and look at that in a different way. So in many cases, while we knew we were catching rockfish, we didn't know necessarily which species. They were lumped into rockfish unidentified or rockfish at large. We also had very little information for individuals of a size range where we weren't actively fishing them. So because we don't fish on babies, we didn't know where the babies settled, or young of the year rockfish. These babies and growing through their first year of life are referred to as young of the year or Yelloweye rockfish. We knew effectively nothing about them because people weren't spending time and effort going out and trying to catch these and assess these and evaluate where they are distributed. So in 2010, following on this status review, 5 species in Puget Sound were petitioned for ESA listing. And after an evaluation of everything we knew and everything we didn't know, making some assumptions where we had to, we actually listed 3 of these species. For the other 2, green striped and red striped rockfish, we couldn't document any declines. There was not enough data to really substantially tell us that declines were occurring there, but in the other 3, we could see it. Now, fortunately for one of these species, we were actually able to delist it in 2017 based on new information. That's a totally separate story, though. So for the rest of the talk, and for the effort that we put into this on the federal side, we're going to talk about Yelloweye and Bocaccio rockfish, just these 2 species. Although the settlement patterns of Yelloweye across all species are used as an indicator of what's going on with these relatively rare, hard to find species. So in assessing these species and listing them under the ESA, the next major step is to determine recovery goals and determine what we're going to do to help improve the status of the species. And so these are kind of 6 broad categories of recovery goals that we established in a plan in 2017. And these were established initially and then formalized, as you can see on bullet 5 there, into a federal recovery plan in 2017. So the work that we're going to talk about today, that Adam's going to expand on, really hits on 3 of these. It's about collecting abundance, distribution, demographic data, and habitat use information, especially for life history stages that we don't know much about. We also need to educate anglers, divers, and the general public about why these fish are important, what role they play in the ecosystem, and why their conservation is really critical. And then lastly, because this is the Salish Sea, not just Puget Sound, but because legal borders are a real thing, we need to coordinate with Fisheries and Oceans Canada and other NGOs and universities and researchers in Canada to try and ensure that any management we're doing is crossing that international boundary. So why focus on these little fish? Why spend our time here? Well, as I said, there was a huge gap. We knew a lot about the adults, we knew a lot about the fisheries-sized individuals, but we really didn't know much about the littles. And so we looked to these individuals, to these newly settled individuals, as an indicator of adult presence and reproductive capacity. If there are babies out there, they had to come from somewhere. So where? Where are the babies? Where can we find them? And what does that tell us about the distribution of the adults? These babies also use a broad variety of habitats and locations, but as I said, we really didn't know much about what drove those patterns. We did know that there were boom and bust cycles though, so in some years, Yelloweye rockfish are a huge part of the diet of birds and salmon and marine mammals and a variety of other species, so they're really fuel for the ecosystem. In some years, not so much, that sporadic recruitment success that I talked about earlier. So in those years, not much of an ecological role, but not having that resource actually also affects the breeding success of birds and salmon and other species. So still definitely a linkage there. So we needed more sampling power than the government had. We had few people working on this, and we just simply needed to get as many eyes out there as we possibly could. So who are you going to call? Well, we would love to say that there was some group out there called Rockfish Busters, and that they would just bust this whole thing open and find all the information we needed. But there really wasn't. There were a lot of divers, there were a lot of spear fishermen, there were a lot of other folks that utilized these habitats in which rockfish are found. But there was not just one group we could go to. We knew that we needed some heavy hitters, though. We knew that we needed to bring some people out who knew the resource, who knew the area, and who could spend the time and effort going out and looking in a systematic way, or even in just a random way, and just telling us about what they find out in the wild. So with that, I'll turn it over to Adam, who took on this project of finding us the heavy hitters and moving the needle forward on our survey efforts. So Adam, let me...
Thanks, Dave. I'll just start with what I think should have been the promotional material for this talk. And I encourage you to take a second and really just drink in this image, because I don't have any guarantees that any slides after this will be better than it. So there it is, our Kevin Costner with the yoy and a diver. Very good. Right, so I think the most important thing to start with is to communicate. I had no experience running a citizen science program before this. I wasn't coming in as some kind of hyper specialized citizen science whisperer. I was working as a contractor in Long Beach for NOAA. I was a NOAA diver at the time. And then my wife got a 2-year fellowship up in Washington, and I found myself with a strong desire to spend a little time up there. And I got in touch with the Rockfish Recovery Coordinator at the time, Dan Tunnis, and he let me know that there was recovery action related to building a survey program for young of your rockfish, and it might just be the right place for me to help out. I was more than happy to do it. And then it turns out I had no desire to ever let it go. So here we are many years later, and we're still working on it. I think that citizen science programs are pretty easy to maybe fantasize about, that they seem like kind of a snap your fingers and you're going to get data, that you maybe sit around a couple beers or a conference table and say, we have this data need, we'll go talk to citizens, and some nebulous intermediate steps later, you've got piles of data to analyze and answer your questions. But that's not quite the reality. There's a lot of intermediate steps in there that you need to define, including how are you going to collect these data, who are you going to involve, what's the best groups to target. If in my case you're just some dude from California coming into Washington, where maybe Californians aren't always viewed positively, you need to build some street cred, as it were. And then once you have achieved those levels, you need to keep people coming back, and only then, along with other hurdles throughout the path, can you get all the data that you need. Understanding that starting from scratch, we should involve a lot of other groups. That's what we did. Before we even put our heads underwater for the first time, we reached out to all manner of experienced groups up in the Northwest to build our survey protocol and rely on their expertise, and quickly learned that there is this trade-off between accessibility for the program and participants and the rigor of the data that they would collect. And so if you imagine on one side, there's very little data rigor, but high accessibility. That means that, say, divers will jump in, and if they see a rockfish, they'll just say, hey, we saw a rockfish, and not even tell us where they were or how long they were diving or even what day it was. And then all the way on the other side, you've got really high data rigor and very low accessibility. Imagine asking divers to go purchase their own stereo video equipment, and they can run the same transects over and over, and they'll maybe set up permanent markers on the reef to make sure they're hitting the same exact transect and giving you the exact length of the fish while processing their stereo video. And that's going to exclude a lot of people, because who's going to want to buy thousands of dollars in stereo video equipment and get permits for putting in fixed objects on a reef? Not a lot of people. So we need to find this kind of middle area. where we can maximize that trade-off. And what we settled on, as illustrated with this wonderful Seattle Aquarium graphic, is what we call a timed roving survey and discrete habitat and depth bins. And what that means, roving, that means that diver can swim anywhere. They're not anchored to a fixed transect tape. They can, if they want to look at one side of a rock, they can go for it. If they want to swim just a touch deeper, they can go for it. They are able to be free. Timed means that they need to record the start and stop time of their survey, and that allows us to relativize the data. If you imagine one diver swimming for 45 minutes and another for 3 minutes, and they both see the same amount of rockfish, that's going to lead to drastically different results. And so we need to have some kind of bound on the effort. The habitat and depth bins are a way to get a bit more specificity out of the data. We don't want to assume that rockfish equally inhabit all habitat types. And often in the Northwest, some sites will have multiple habitat types. It's not unheard of for there to be a kelp forest and a natural reef and an eelgrass bed all in the same area. So we want to get an idea of where you'll find the young of your rockfish. And then depth, rockfish do not equally inhabit depth or different depth stratifications. So whether they're in the shallows, anything less than 21 feet, intermediate from 21 to 60, and deeper is going to be of use. And maybe one day we'll be lucky enough, we'll get a super deep and we can get some technical diving going, and we'll have a bin greater than 150 feet. But until then, just the 3 bins. But rockfish can also be pretty tough to identify, and that is potentially a barrier to participation. If we were to ask our participants to know exactly how to identify every rockfish, let alone young of year, which are even more difficult, I feel like we'd get a lot of people walking away, maybe myself included. So the way we handled that is we just used 2 different morphological features. The first is whether or not the fish has an elongate body or a deep body, here on the left. And the second is the presence or absence of a dorsal spot. In using just those 2 features, you can narrow down within a species or within a species group what you're finding. And that makes us, again, maximize that trade-off between the data rigor and who wants to participate. And even just going over that 2 slides, it may sound like a lot, but you actually are only asking for 4 questions while you're underwater. How long were you surveying? What depth were you at? What habitat were you in? And then what is your count of any of the 4 morphological groups? And that's so simple. You can put it onto a slate and hand it out to people. And that slate can be moderately sized, as my dog assures us. She is a medium to smaller size dog, and that slate's even smaller than her, so it's easy and very portable. And we can then move on with these great methods onto how do we bring people in. And if the event, anybody has tried to start a citizen science program before, or any program that requires participation, there can be some anxiety at the start. You see other citizen groups that are up and running, and they have huge amounts of participation, and you have 0. And you might feel like, oh, wow, I'm failing if I don't have hundreds and hundreds of data points added a year. And so you might try to do what I would call the everything everywhere all at once approach, or the shotgun approach, where you think that you should be doing 50 talks a year and trying to engage every single citizen, or every single nonprofit and dive club and university group possible. But that's not realistic. One thing we found early on, that if you go out to a dive club and you give a presentation, you're invariably going to find a couple people coming up to you at the end saying, I'm in. Heck yeah. I go diving every week. You're going to have more data than you know what to do with. And then you never hear from them again. And so that's not a really responsible way to build your citizen program. And instead, if we try a grassroots approach, or if I'm going to painfully try and stick to my best picture theme, the try and be English patient approach, you build a relationship with a few groups, and then you try and let the program grow on its own. You don't drive yourself wild trying to reach everybody all the time. You'll be spread too thin. You need to let the program grow on its own. And that is what we did. And this is the path that we took, starting off with NOAA, and then Harbor Wild Watch and the Sea Dock Society joined on very shortly thereafter, and have moved on to all these other incredible groups since. And in preparing for this talk, I found this image from 2015 at our first outreach event. I assure you there are other people over here, but just couldn't help but notice that fresh-faced young child starting off with rockfish outreach, and now you have this seasoned, weathered person giving a presentation in front of you. And there are other components. Now that you've recruited people, we have all these different organizations, we have a wonderful methodology. How do we keep people? And I think the most important component of that is just engagement. Go out there with your partners, with the citizens participating, collect data with them, go through the exact same methods, show that what you're doing and what they're doing are not different, and that in the eyes of the program, all the data are the same. If there are questions over email, do your best to get back to people right away. And that way try and build some momentum. Also, show that their data are useful. Put together reports and peer-reviewed publications that show that their data have a direct benefit to management in science, because they do, but they absolutely do. But it could be easy to get bogged down in taking care of the program, that the reporting gets kind of left out. And next thing you know, it's been 10 years and the data are sitting in a spreadsheet somewhere and you haven't gotten anything done. And that's going to make people think that their data aren't useful, and that's the last thing we want. Also, acknowledge that the people that you're working with are pretty darn incredible. And I think one benefit of our program is that it's so small and it can be adaptive, and the participants can kind of make it their own in whatever way they want. Whether it's as one of our partners on the right, Edgar, is showing a little tool he made that's 10 centimeters long, which is our cutoff for a yoy. He wanted to make sure he wasn't getting anything wrong, or giving folks the background on, say, data entry as I am in the left, and allowing them to come up with ways to improve and streamline that. And we've had folks that have used this program to kind of build their CV and leverage it into different jobs, which couldn't make me any happier. We've had folks we have had folks apply successfully for grants through Patty to build the program, which again, that's awesome, makes my job much easier. And so just acknowledge that the folks that you work with are incredible and valuable, and don't fall into some trap that I think some people might do, which is the citizens working on your project are cattle or something, and that couldn't be further from the truth. And then just to really prime the pump, in addition to all these important components, give them stuff. So if they do a certain amount of surveys, give them a marine themed t-shirt, because who doesn't like that? Altogether, we've applied the methods, the recruitment and the persistence, and we've found some pretty promising results. These data are only through 2021, and even though he's on mute, I can hear Dave wondering where the 2022 data are, and I promise they're coming, and I promise that when they do come, this partner component is going to be way up here. And so I think this is also a key distinction. I don't say citizen, I say partner, and there's two reasons for that. One, I think sometimes people use the term citizen in a bit of a derogatory way, as if their input is somehow less than, and I don't agree with that at all. And then two, there are groups that are professional scientist groups that are working on another project, and we ask them if they'll take UA data while they're out there, and so they're also partners, not pure citizens. So I conflate those two because they're all part of our coalition to build our survey team. And then professional, that just means we're the people taking money to lead the program. You can see we just can't grow the way they can. And I've never been so happy to lose a competition in my life. And this is not just impressive on plot spatially, it's pretty cool as well. If you compare in 2015, our survey effort, and we had the CDOC Society took us out, and we hit a few spots in the San Juans, and then otherwise we were kind of relegated to a few areas in Central Sound. And compare that to 2021, and look where we are. We are all over the place. And these points don't even include repeat visits. If we scaled these points to size for number of visits, they'd be even more impressive. But I'm an American, I'm a capitalist, I want more, I always want more data. And in order to achieve that, we applied for more funding in 2020 with the CDOC Society. And their response was more or less, what would we be getting if we gave you money? How many more dives will you get if we fund you performing more outreach? And like most red-blooded scientists, I immediately bristled at their feedback, thinking, "How well, you can't do that. It's too vague." And then after I got over myself, I realized we absolutely can do that, because we do know how much effort people are putting out. And all we need to do is compare that with our outreach effort. And this linear regression, it's significant, it's very, very striking, I will note. So when I say outreach effort, I count that as giving a presentation or going to meet a group in person or doing a dive and showing people the methods. I don't include an email exchange, I don't include a phone call. Those are important, and cumulatively they might kind of push the needle, but I'm also not going to go back through all my phone calls and emails and figure out what they look like. So we are left with this. I think it's still pretty impressive, but there's a problem. For you math gurus, that's not a great return on investment, right? For every one more outreach event, we get 2.5 more dives. That doesn't seem like it's really impressive. So we can't just leave it with this. We have to further separate out the data into groups. And before I dive into this, I'll just note, you might wonder, why is there a NOAA team included in this? So this is for people not funded on this project within NOAA. They work on other areas, but they're divers, and they were so taken with the excitement of looking for young-of-year rockfish in the Salish Sea that they joined us on their own time to come out and count. So if you are working for NOAA and you are sitting in your office, guess what? You too could contribute to these points, and I look forward to you joining us. But right, back to the data. So 2 key points here. The first is that it looks like there is a startup investment. If I can do my best John Madden telestrator. So we've got startup, right? So here's Lighthouse Dive Center. So boom, boom, then up. Each of these points represents a year. And so it takes two years, right? Boom, boom, then up. Boom, boom, then up. It takes a few years of outreach before you really start to see input. That makes sense, right? You need to build a relationship. You need to build confidence that you're going to be around for a while. You're not just some jerk Californian coming up to tell residents of Washington how to do things. But it's even more interesting, I believe, because over time the slopes increase. So Harbor Wild Watch is our first group, and they have the lowest slope. That means that there's basically the most outreach effort for the least return, but then it increases over time, with Lighthouse Dive Center and Emerald Dive Club slightly higher than that, and then Point Defiance Zoo and Aquarium and NOAA affiliates being even higher. So it's not just that there's a startup cost within a group, but also across the entire program. And that makes sense, right? That once you start getting some results, once you start getting more participation, the diving community is small, people talk, and there can be a bit more momentum. But you might still be underwhelmed, and I wouldn't fully blame you. That still, it seems like there's a good amount of effort that has to go in to get moving. And to that, I say first, you are asking a lot. You are asking a lot of a diver who maybe only goes out once a month, once every few months, and maybe they just want to sit underwater and stare at an anemone or a crab, and you're asking them to take data for you. And so I think that we need to be very cognizant of that in what we're returning. But along with that, a lot of the citizen science literature focuses on data quality, more or less, can we trust them? Or what do we need to do to start? But not necessarily what do we have to do to keep it going and to build it responsibly. And I think that it's incredibly helpful to have that information, so you don't sit around at the bar or at a conference room and say, oh yeah, we can just do this, we can just get citizens to collect data for us. You actually engage with what's required to build your program. And Lisa will talk shortly about her assistance in helping us turn this into a manuscript so we can share that more widely. And then a bit of a shameless plug, I don't think it's just a startup cost within a group or across programs, but I think even further, you can count this as a startup cost across different species of interest. And I think that this program is really ideal for finding rare species. And so if there are other rare species in the Salish Sea that you want to include, it's as simple as adding a field on our data sheet in a bit of coordination with our partners. So we can actually build the capacity even further for questions of interest. You don't have to go through that startup phase again and again. But I can't leave you out of here with a few biological results. And so here, our first kind of standard plot showing effort in the dashed and then young of year encounter in the solid. We could find a couple neat points. The first is that seeing the low effort in November through January, it would appear that people don't like to go diving in the winter. Can't say I blame them, but good to see our data tracks with what I expect reality to be. Also, there's 2 points, 2 kind of peaks on this plot. And the first one of note is this slow one that happens in summer through fall. And that was the going wisdom when we started, that you really kind of have this young of year season during that time. And that's when the rockfish recruit. Our data show that's actually the deep body no dorsal spot yoi. And those are the coppers, browns, and quills. But then there's this other peak that happened in March. And this peak is driven entirely by March of 2021. And those were all elongate dorsal spotted yoi. And you also know that the error bars are massive compared to the other ones. And that's what happens when for every 10 or 15 minutes that you survey, you find maybe 1 yoi or 0 yoi or 2 yoi. And then on your 10 or 15 minutes of surveying, you find 800. This is what happens to your data, but this is also what we would expect to happen during a jackpot event. And so we had to ask, was that a jackpot event in the March of 2021? And so in our super course evaluation, it sure looks like it. If you compare encounter of elongate dorsal spot through all other years and then compare it to 2021, it's not significant, but I'm guessing that if we split this out to just that time of year, just that 5 or 6 or 7 week period, you'd reduce a lot of the error and you would have a different result. But just for the purposes of this exercise, it sure looks compelling. And if you look at it spatially, it is also compelling. If you look at our encounter at all sites, averaged over every other survey year, you see that we find almost no elongate dorsal spotted yoi. Maybe a couple by here on Whidbey, by Admiralty Inlet, maybe a few random ones down by Central Sound. And then just in 2021, not only are they spread out a lot more, but the encounter is a lot higher by Admiralty Inlet. So it sure looks compelling for a jackpot event for elongate dorsal spotted in 2021. And then even more interesting in relation to the listed species, 2022 may have been the year of the Yelloweye, where in all the previous years of our surveys, we found a single young of year Yelloweye. And I think that may have been 2016. And then in 2022, our surveyors found, I believe, 2 yoi and 1 barely juvenile sized, and then an additional surveyor not conducting a survey found one as well. So, and they were all kind of huddled right here near the entrance to the Whidbey Basin in kind of northern or central sound. So we have this really cool relationship with additional Yelloweye in 2022, which also shows like, hey, we're getting more eyes in the water, we're seeing more fish. This is exactly what we want. So we're all super happy, right? We're building this program, we're getting great results. So now what do we do? I think what I would like the most is to stop having to caveat my results so intensely. I'm sure you guys are all scientists that you might be sitting there looking at the rockfish results I presented and thinking that they are completely confounded with our effort, even if we are relativizing our surveys by time. If we're looking in more places, those places may not all be the same. So how can we relativize that spatial effort? And how can you start saying, yeah, well, we didn't survey this site in 2020, and we're seeing a bunch of stuff when we went there in 2022. So we have been working with this whole group of organizations, as in particular the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, to put together this really cool Bayesian approach to account for just that. And we are in the final stages of review, and I'm very hopeful that starting in 2023, we can start actually putting this index into use and being able to say a lot more about our results. And then the last thing I'll say before I hand it over to Lisa is that we almost have a problem of too much success, that our funding, it stays the same every year, and we could not be more grateful for it. But as the program grows, we have more applications for the data, which requires more effort on our part. We have more people looking to join, which again, could not be happier. And we have long-standing partners that we want to make sure understand how much we value them, and that we want to give them our attention as well. And we have limited resources and time with which to apply to all those different areas. And so we need to be really cognizant of how we are building the program and maintaining it. Like a pie, it is a good problem to have, but just something to keep an eye on. Right, so I think that's it for me, and there'll be questions at the end, and I will hand it over to Lisa for her to talk about all the help she and the library have provided us on this effort manuscript.
Thank you so much, Adam. Hello again, everyone. So we've heard about rockfish, we've heard about the Young of the Year Citizen Science Program, and now I would like to discuss how the library helped this collaboration. I think Dave and Adam's project is a good example of how our research service can save NOAA scientists and analysts time when they want to understand what related research is happening in their field. The library also loves to introduce people to library tools and strategies that could help them fish on their own in the future. So our service is a bit of a mystery, and I hope to now demystify it and take it from there. So a bit about our service first. NOAA Central Library's research service provides NOAA policy analysts and scientists with information gathering support for evidence-based decision-making and inquiry. So in a nutshell, our librarians develop extensive search strategies to conduct thorough literature reviews. Specifically, what we do is we scope and design research questions so that the literature we provide is precise and responsive to your research need. We record everything we do so that the process is transparent and reproducible, which is particularly important with ESA. We use authoritative sources to find our references, ensuring that you get the best science out there. And not only do we provide peer-reviewed literature, we also include gray literature from government repositories, conferences, universities, and research organizations. We use cool tools like Lit Searcher, Citation Chaser, and Swift Active Screener to improve the process. We even build full text libraries of references that we deliver through EndNote to our clients. And finally, we can turn those articles into a bibliography that we can publish in the NOAA Institutional Repository if you think that would be helpful. So I have a link there to our website, which gives more detail about our service, and I encourage you to take a look if you are a NOAA person who plans to do some research. Working with the library is extremely collaborative. Despite this very busy chart, we do try to take as little of the client's time as possible, but we do need your subject expertise to do what we do. Most of our collaborations have 4 phases. The light green section there shows what the client will be doing on their own for a project, from the initial request, answering scope questions, getting set up with EndNote, to the actual screening of articles. The middle section shows how often we actually meet with you. On average, we meet maybe twice, often virtually, almost always virtually nowadays, but sometimes it's even less depending on the deliverable that we're providing for you. And then on the very bottom, the light blue section shows what the librarian is doing during each phase. So you can see we're keeping busy throughout the whole experience. So now I'd like to tell the story of Dave and Adam's team and how specifically we helped the UA Citizen Science Project. So I had worked with Dave in the summer of 2021, helping him with the update of an ESA rockfish project. But in the fall of 2021, Dave went to our website and filled out the research project form there. The form gives the library just a brief overview of the literature need and the timeline for the request. And then that form goes to our service manager, who reviews the information, and if the project seems viable, sends a scoping document back to the client with lots of questions that help us take a deeper dive into the actual research need. Dave told me that it took the team about 30 minutes to fill out the scoping document that we sent back to them. In that document, we asked questions like, what question do you want your literature review to answer? What will the review be used for? So for example, article publication, a tech memo, a mandated report, policy decision, exploration of gaps and gluts, and research funding, anything. Do you have any relevant research already? We want to actually see what these exemplar articles might be. How old should the articles be? What's the geographical area that we'll be focusing on? Should we find articles in any language besides English? We ask you to list keywords, organizations, specific researchers in the field, etc., that we might find helpful. This is probably where the majority of the team's work was spent in anticipation of meeting with me. From the response in the scope, or the responses, I should say, in the scoping document, the assigned librarian, in this case me, begins to do a number of things in preparation for the first meeting with the client. We define the research question. We get a sense of what the goal is for the body of literature that we are going to collect, what issue each article should be addressing. And we also learn what the literature review will be used for. So in Dave and Adam's case, after reading about their project, I learned that they were exploring whether literature about their topic existed. They were looking to see if there was a gap or a glut of literature focusing on the measurement of engagement in citizen science projects, especially those involving conservation and, even better, marine management, such as their Yelloweye Rockfish project. They knew that lots of articles existed about citizen science, and they really do. There's so much out there. But they specifically wanted to work with data-driven evaluations of these programs, quantitative evaluations of engagement methods and their efficacy, all of this so that they could use it to write the manuscript that Adam mentioned earlier. So we ended up agreeing that the research question was, how are citizen science programs measuring engagement in marine management / conservation and sustaining long-term engagement? So the next step for the librarian is to break down the scoping document responses into concepts and then develop lists of keywords that describe these concepts. Ultimately, these keywords build elemental search strings that we put together using Boolean operators to find articles in databases and gray literature sources. Very boring stuff, but important. We use a spreadsheet called the search strategy template. collects all of this information. It's a custom tool that the research team developed. The recording process is a widely accepted best practice in our world, in the evidence synthesis methods world, but people only get this simplified tool when they work with us. And I'm showing some of that here in this screen. In many ways, I think it's the most important tool of the collaboration. It's shared with the client. It allows the entire process to be recorded, transparent, and again, reproducible for the future if more articles were needed. And it builds the conceptual framework for the research. The scientist and the librarian are on the same page. I also think it's where the beauty of the collaboration becomes apparent. The scientist can provide their expertise with the subject through the keywords, and the librarian their experience with search strategies to come up with the precise search strings. It cuts down on meetings by also being an asynchronous tool as well. So again, in January of 2021, I met with Dave and Adam and their team to go over the search strategy. They added terms, made it clear what they wanted. They shared some exemplar articles, so I had a sense of what they were looking for, and told me what they were not looking for as well, which is very helpful, especially in the screening process, which I'm going to get to later. We initially broke down the research question into 6 main concepts: terms for data, for citizen science, engagement, field, marine, outreach. I tested different combinations of search strings using these keywords in the database Web of Science, which is one of our bigger indexes here at NOAA, and I shared the results with Dave and kept refining my searches until they were yielding really strong results. So the string on the bottom of the screen that you see worked best. Interestingly, it used the most basic citizen science keyword. That is kind of the keyword in the publishing word for this particular topic. It used the full outreach and data concept terms, so all those keywords, and completely cut out, shockingly, the engagement terms, the field terms, and the marine concepts, which I initially thought would be helpful. So essentially, to put it very bluntly, we cast a really wide net initially, but through testing, we basically fine-tuned the search and used a very small, a much smaller search than one would have anticipated. And after that, once I had that, I started searching databases and gray literature sources, recording my searches in the spreadsheet, and I downloaded everything into EndNote since we deliver our full text libraries using this tool. Just as a point, NOAA has a license for EndNote, so everyone at NOAA can get EndNote through the library. I searched a number of authoritative sources, including those listed here, the 10 databases. We subscribe to most of them. ProQuest, I might want to point out, represents multiple databases, such as the Aquatic Science and Fisheries Abstracts, Earth Atmosphere and Aquatic Science databases, and eBook Central. I also searched in Environment Complete from EBSCO through the Department of Commerce's library, and only the librarians have access to the Dimensions database, which is something we use for the research service specifically. And lens.org, by the way, is available for free for any of you who might be interested in checking out a really powerful database. For gray literature, I selected a few standard sources like the NOAA Institutional Repository, and a plug for that because we're very proud of it here at NOAA Central. The Policy Commons and Google Scholar, which I think is a place where a lot of the researchers go, because I've never had a project where a scientist has not told me that they use Google Scholar. Dave and his team provided other sources they thought might have published on the topic, such as Fisheries and Oceans Canada, the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, and Coastal Conservation Association. And last, I did a search using our search string, that beautiful little search string that worked so well in the end, and looked for publications on .gov, .edu, and .org domains. In the end, I found 26,000 raw results. That's all together at all these sources. It's a hell of a lot of literature. But after deduplicating and tightening the inclusion criteria, I ended up delivering an initial set of 905 citations to Dave with abstracts and complete metadata. Well, you can imagine 905 articles is way more than the 100 that Dave and his team had hoped to work with for their manuscripts. So He agreed to be set up with a tool called Swift Active Screener that the library sometimes employs for screening large bodies of literature. It is a software product from Sciome that is web-based, it's collaborative, and it allows for systematic citation review. It uses artificial intelligence to pare down literature searches and identify the most relevant resources based on what you include and exclude. So essentially, as the review proceeds, Active Screener observes your screening responses, it analyzes the titles and abstracts of those citations, and associates the patterns of words and phrases found in the chosen abstracts with what has been included and excluded. And in doing that, Active Screener is able to present the articles that are most likely to be included next, according to its own statistical model. So ultimately, the tool is designed to reduce the overall time burden of screening articles. The role that the library takes in this is that it sets up NOAA individuals or teams with Swift accounts. We upload the articles to be screened and add any seed articles to begin informing the AI about the type of articles you may want to include. The library can provide some training, but honestly, I mean, Dave trained himself, of course, because there's some wonderful short videos and there's it's very intuitive. Librarians also add keywords to help with decision making. So these show up as either green or for included terms or red for excluded terms in each abstract. And I'll show you an abstract in just a moment. Dave's list was really short, but it included words that had not been helpful in the original search string, but were still thematically important. So including them in the screening in a tool that looked at the abstracts differently than the databases did helped find the gems in those 905 relevant articles. So really quickly, I want to show you a little bit. Dave chose to do the screening alone for his team. So as he read through the abstracts, each one of these is a screenshot of an abstract, and decided to include or exclude an article, a bar graph on the top right of the screen showed the estimated recall. The number goes up as you make choices, and the algorithm figures out which of the remaining unscreened documents are most likely to be relevant. So this helps the screener know when they can stop screening. And in fact, there's a message when you reach that 95% predicted inclusion threshold. It's an active learning model, which means that ultimately the AI will figure out what are the most relevant articles without you having to review all 905 of them. So luckily, I just wanted to show you this because the tool using Swift Active Screener is still a time investment. Dave spent about 8 hours screening articles. But that said, he still considered it a major time saver. He did a lit review in 1 workday, which I think is pretty awesome. Here we can see some screenshots that Dave took to show his progress from beginning to end of the screening. The pie chart and the bar graph show what was screened, included, and excluded. And then in the bottom chart, it's a graph that summarizes how the machine learning worked for the project. So if you look along the x-axis, you can see the total number of documents screened, and the y-axis shows the percentage of included documents that were found. The green line on top represents the threshold of 95% included articles. So what this means is that once the AI hits the 95% of articles it believes are relevant, you can stop searching, or you can stop looking at the abstracts. So in Dave's case, it looks like he achieved 95% recall after screening about 65% of the 905 articles that I provided to him originally. So what does that look like? Once David finished screening, it looked like 111 perfect articles. At least I think so. He shows, I downloaded those 111 articles and I delivered them full text to him through EndNote, which came all the way, because I'm in Maryland, he's in the West Coast, it came through the email. And this was just about the right amount of literature that the team wanted to work with when they wrote their manuscript this past year. So it's been a year. And since the delivery, since then, the teams told me a bit about how the articles have helped them. Some quotes were that they were happy with the article's responsiveness to their research topic, the precision of the articles we provided. They commented on the thoroughness and said that there's no way they could have found some of the articles that we had because they just didn't have access. And they appreciated the citability of the articles. We made sure to only include the most authoritative information. The most important, as they've written their manuscript, I think the literature review really contextualized beyond their group the importance of long-term engagement of scientists and conservation. So to sum up, in the end, the research service saved Dave and Adam's team a lot of time. They invested a total of 9.5 hours working with me directly or through our tools, meaning they had more time to spend with rockfish. And we did the rest of the work on the literature review in 35 hours. We did it for free for NOAA people. So through the library's expertise and tools, we provided the best literature possible for the team to use in their manuscript. And we pride ourselves on that at NOAA Central. And I had a really good time working with these guys. They're inspiring. I hope you felt inspired by what you learned today. And they're working on a gorgeous project out west that's doing good citizen science work. It's helping rockfish, it's helping conservation, and it was absolutely a win-win. So if you are a NOAA scientist or policy analyst that might benefit from a similar collaboration with my research service, please contact us. I provided the link yet again at the bottom of the page on the right. So with that, I invite my colleagues to come back and join me on the webcam. And we have, let's see, it's 3 o'clock already. Let's take a minute to see if any of you have any questions. Thank you guys so much for doing this. I think it was really interesting and I learned a lot. I have to tell you, we've had some really funny comments about, apparently at Northeast Fisheries Science Center, they call yoys yo-yos.
I've not heard that one.
Yeah, and people love the Field of Dreams references.
Well, while you're looking over the questions real quick, and kind of curating those, I'll just add real quick, again, for scientists, for anybody looking to potentially utilize the service and coordinate with the library, I'll tell you that really what we ended up doing, fundamentally kind of comes down to the approach that we normally take to try and find research is not terribly reproducible in a lot of cases. Somebody says, well, how hard did you look? Where did you look? What did you find and how? And when the answer is, well, I went to Google Scholar and I spent a couple hours and this is what I got, that's not good enough. It's not best available science. It's not something that we can stand on. And so working with the library like this, we have a Boolean search string. We have a list of databases. We know when the effort was put in, how it was screened, what was included and not. If somebody says, did you get them all? My answer is, yeah, I Pokemon this thing. I caught them all the best science. Now, there's obviously one or two we're going to miss along the way, but we've got abstracts from presentations that occurred at conferences I didn't even know existed. We've got gray literature from universities that we're aware of with a professor that was working in maybe a cultural anthropology class instead of a biology class. And so we just didn't have that connection, and we didn't make that connection on a specific paper that dealt with rockfish in some way, shape, or form. So it really is a thorough, defensible way to get the best available information and incorporate it into your science. And it's been a huge boon to us.
Thank you so much.
Do we have any questions there, Lisa?
We do. We have one that's asking about the literature search, and absolutely, if you are part of NOAA, then you can use the NOAA Central Library service. And again, the link, we do have our handouts attached as our slides are a handout, so you're welcome to grab that and look at the links there. But please reach out to us if there's any issues about whether we can help you or not. We'll let you know through the form. And we'll give it another second. For those of you, I just want to also remind you that we are recording this, and if you would like to share this presentation, I'm going to have it uploaded to the NOAA Central Library YouTube channel just in a couple of hours. So please do. Let's give it another second. Let's see if we get any more questions.
And I'll just say while we're waiting here, if you've heard this talk today and you're thinking, boy, I dive occasionally in Puget Sound, or I've got friends or colleagues or anyone else up there that does, contact us. Reach out to Adam, reach out to myself. We would love to get you involved. It doesn't have to be a big lift. You don't have to dive for us all day, for 5 years in a row. To be honest, we have a lot of records in the database that come from a diver who dove once, twice, and then got busy with other things. It's still valuable information. Even just 1 or 2 observations here and there can really add up when you kind of scale that up across the whole of the community. So please reach out, please get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you.
Yes, absolutely. And again, I'm tempted to come across the country and join the divers. I've been thinking about that for about a year now. I did have another question about the research service, and thank you for your interest. We love helping people, but the service is specific for NOAA employees and contractors. I think that's it. Again, I just want to thank you guys. It's been amazing to hear about this whole project. It's been great helping you. I'm looking forward to seeing the manuscript eventually, and make sure it crosses across my thing. And good luck with everything you do for conservation and in terms of helping broaden our ability to help people in various projects with citizen science projects. All right, have a wonderful day, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Everyone.